Hi everyone, I'm Baumann Larsen. I'm the CEO, founder and VR designer at Dimension Design. I would like to take this opportunity to thank Jean-Michel Blottier for creating an amazing inaugural RealTime Conference, and Alex Colomb for asking me to be his co-host for the architecture sessions. My talk for the RealTime Conference 2020 is called The Art and Science of Virtual Architecture, Shaping the Human Experience in VR in Positive Ways. It is about what I love the most, designing beautiful virtual architecture in VR to make people in those spaces feeling good and being productive. After telling you a little bit about my background, I will frame the talk with the apparent lack of professional virtual architecture on the market. My approach to design will include lessons from environmental psychology and visual storytelling to shape the architecture to be comfortable and effective as workspaces. I will describe how my designs seek to evoke desired emotions, thoughts and actions in the users to ensure that the virtual spaces shape the human experience in positive and inspiring ways. I will continue with the relevance of visual storytelling and world building for VR, because before discussing a few of my own VR designs, first with 3 minor case studies, follow up by a major case study, which was my design for the Norwegian VR startup Dimension 10. I'm educated an architect, and I worked in visual storytelling in architecture and entertainment for a quarter of a century. As a computer graphics generalist, I've taken on a diverse set of roles, from script writing to design, 3D lighting, VFX, and editing, cinematography, direction, and producing. Visual storytelling through design and images has been a red thread through the years, as exemplified in this concept design of mine for a metro station in Oslo. I started professionally with VR in Houston in 1995 in a small VR startup called CyberSim, and we worked with local companies and organizations like Compaq Computers, Boeing, and NASA. However, we quickly realized that VR was not mature enough for a greater public. So instead, I returned home to Norway and started first one and then a second architecture visualization company. Using novel tools in production, like this 1999 Lightscape visualization, has been another red thread through my career. My background as an architect and my skills in creating CG environments for architecture have also resulted in funny side projects, like this digital set I created for the music video I Can't Get Over for the Swedish artist September. Over the past 10 years, I've designed, developed, and produced AR apps and game-like 3D and VR applications for architecture, industry, and entertainment. And here's an example of a novel AR visualization using a box marker from 2012. It was created for the MIPIM event in Cannes, and it shows the headquarters of the largest Norwegian bank in Norway, DNB. When we first ventured into mobile AR in 2011, we designed an interactive mobile narrative that communicated that Tine, Norway's largest dairy producer, now had locally produced and distributed milk. It was extremely popular and it was downloaded more than 110,000 times, and it led to a follow-up, as seen in this image from 2013. And here young and old alike could play with an interactive AR coloring app, complete with 2 talking miniature cows running around on your breakfast table. When 17 years after I first started working in VR, learned about the Oculus Kickstarter, I decided to quit my own company and start anew, doing only VR and AR. In 2013 and 14, I directed 2 3D graphics bachelor students in a project that fused an interactive narrative in the form of a puzzle game for a novel take on architecture visualization in VR. Simulation sickness aside, I was now certain that this was what I wanted to do moving forward, knowing full well it was a much narrower path than creating glossy images and films of other architects' designs. From what I have seen, most existing VR meeting and workplace solutions feature very simple architectural designs, where the quality and the materials and the lighting does not seem to have been critical to their applications. This is in stark contrast to the money and time spent on brick and mortar buildings to create effective and beautiful workspaces. Le Corbusier's seminal book Toward an Architecture was originally published in 1927, and it argued for and explored the concept of modern architecture. Hated by some, made a manifesto by others, it is arguably one of the most important books on architectural theory of the past century. Modernism was in essence a rejection of ornament, such as found in the beautiful Art Deco movement, in favor of something much more minimal and almost purely functional. We can see an example of this here in Le Corbusier and Pierre Chaneret's design for the Villa Savoy in France. Now, I'm not arguing for the continuation of the architectural language of modernism to be brought into VR as some golden standard. But I am, much like Le Corbusier and Frank Lloyd Wright, arguing for a new architecture that makes for better living and working, not in brick and mortar spaces, but in virtual reality. It is the power of combining the sense of being somewhere, here and now, with the possibility to offer a larger-than-life experience, similar to that of science fiction films, that has drawn me as an architect to explore the design of virtual architectural spaces. My friend VR artist Kevin Mack says that, quote, "The fundamental innovation of virtual reality is spatial presence, the sensation of being present in a place." In exploring this, he continues, quote, "Throughout history, artists, like architects, have used spatial presence to mediate experience in reality. VR makes it possible to mediate experience unconstrained by the limits of reality." Quote. With the essence of VR being that we feel we are present somewhere, and our limbic system holding so much power over our feelings, it makes sense to look at research into environmental psychology and what it has taught us about how our built environment affects us, so that we can achieve powerful experiences when we design virtual spaces. There is evidence that supports this, both as something we sense intuitively and have started to measure scientifically. Winston Churchill famously said, "We shape our buildings, and afterwards our buildings shape us." Later, epidemiologists found that people raised in cities are more prone to mental disorders than those raised in the countryside, and neuroscientists find that people living in cities have a much higher risk of schizophrenia. Researcher Colin Allard has investigated the psychological impact of design and has found that people's thoughts, emotions, and physical responses are strongly affected by our built environment. If a building facade is plain, it has a uniform plainness to it, it affects people negatively. While the opposite is true with the more varied and complex facades, such as this found in a Paris shopping street. In an experiment in Iceland in 2013, participant viewing computer-generated residential street scenes reported those with the most architectural variation having high restorative qualities. Now, one theory here is that the visual complexity of environments acts as a kind of mental balm. And this is perhaps because they remind us of natural surroundings, which often are spatially very complex. In my own architectural designs, curves have always been present, possibly as a nod to futurism and science fiction. It could be that humans in general, though, may like curves better than straight lines. In a study from 2011 by Descure et al., comparing the effects of rounded and straight-edged furniture on people's emotions, curvilinear settings elicited higher amounts of pleasant, unarousing emotions, such as feeling relaxed, peaceful, and calm, than the rectilinear settings. While it may not always be practical or space efficient to have curved spaces and furniture in our homes and cities, virtual spaces don't have such limitations. Interestingly though, curved surfaces are expensive in VR too, but from a purely technical point of view, as they require a lot of triangles to look smooth, and therefore occupy a larger part of your polygon budget than if using a more rectilinear design. In the arts, the color blue is mostly known for its association with sorrow, feeling blue. But it has a secret superpower. In a study at the University of British Columbia in 2009, people were put in rooms of different colors and then asked to perform a series of tasks. People in the blue space performed worse on short-term memory tasks, while doing much better when tasked with creative assignments requiring imagination. According to scientists, the color blue triggers associations with the sky and the ocean. Recalling a beach experience acts as a kind of mental relaxation exercise, making us more aware of possibilities afforded by our own imagination. Psychologist John Myers-Levy at the Carlson School of Management conducted an experiment examining the relationship between ceiling height and thinking style. When in a high-ceilinged room, people excel at puzzles in which the answer touches on the theme of freedom, such as liberated or limited. And this is because airy spaces prime us to feel free. In contrast, people in a low-ceiling room are perhaps not surprisingly much quicker at solving anagrams involving confinement, such as bound, restrained, and restricted. When test subjects from the University of British Columbia study were put in a room the color of blood, they were much better at skills that required accuracy and attention to detail, such as recalling numbers from short-term memory that were random or identifying spelling mistakes. Scientists says that this is because people associate red with danger, making us much more alert and aware. Studies from New York show that lighting streets and urban areas at night results in considerably less crime, and other studies tells us that people feel safer in environments that are generally well lit. Depending on your lighting design, virtual environments will therefore either feel safe or unsafe to be in. The design of real-world spaces, and by the definition of VR, also virtual architectural spaces, have real cognitive consequences. Now that we have looked at some of the science that can support the design of effective and comfortable and engaging virtual spaces, let's see where to find inspiration from the art forms of cinema and theater. When designing a virtual space, identifying the proper cultural signifiers, as well as materials and virtual construction methods for design, will help build a proper story space. In theater and film, in particular in sci-fi and fantasy genres, proper world building is key to support both characters and narrative. Environmental storytelling as seen in immersive theater, like here with Punch Drunk's Sleep No More, is even more powerful in VR, since the user in many cases can linger and even pick up and examine objects. Therefore, every prop, artwork, and piece of furniture you put into a scene in VR should support the narrative of the space, or it risks telling the user a completely different story. Filmmakers have long taken advantage of color to impact emotions. Color grading and the creative use of lighting is used to change the emotional tone of a scene to support the story and the characters. While the choice of colors in a virtual scene can't always be changed, we can use color grading to change the overall tone and color of a VR scene in post and hence modify its emotional tone. Current popular real-time engines like Unity and Unreal Engine have post-processing effects to allow designers of virtual environments similar kind of tools as filmmakers to impact the emotions of the users by manipulating lights and colors alone. In the fairly old game Battlefield 3, the scenes were processed to look harsher, less than that of a sunny island vacation, to mimic how we're used to seeing warfare portrayed on film. Now let's take a look at the first of 4 case studies where I have implemented lessons from the science of environmental psychology and the art of visual storytelling. How can visual storytelling be important when designing virtual architectural spaces for education or training, you may ask? Let's look at a small prototype produced in the space of about a week to demonstrate industry training using a physical interface of a pipe valve created while I worked at the Future Group. I designed a simplistic room and addressed it with modified 3D props that I bought from various online stores. Anything the user is interacting with should have a high detail level, as it will be fairly close to the user's eye line. A technical artist then lit and weathered the surfaces to make it more realistic. This gave the users the feeling of the space having been in use, and such environmental storytelling can enhance the sense of presence and also help put the user in the right state of mind for training. A few post-processing effects were used, including glow for the overhead lights. If surfaces were aged too much, however, it could give the user the wrong story, one of neglect of maintenance. Of course, this could be used to great effect as well, depending on the training scenario. Now let's take a look at the small video from the experience. Holocap is a Norwegian VR startup with a real-time volumetric capture and playback technology that allow human performance with virtually no uncanny valley in VR. In 2016, I was asked to design their first demo, and our idea was to let the user experience a kung fu performance by world-class wushu artist Kim Gibson, seen in this image. Inspired by the scene where Neo fights Morpheus in the movie Matrix, my design was a fusion of the West with curved concrete, Japanese shoji doors, and Chinese artworks that are referencing wushu or kung fu. The diffuse lighting scheme allowed the captures to integrate fairly well, while simultaneously creating a relaxed feeling to the space, which again increased comfort. Real-world scale on familiar elements such as furniture, doors, columns, and beams are crucial in VR, unless you intentionally want the users to feel either smaller or larger than they are in real life. This means they will either feel more powerful or less powerful than they are in the reality. Also, elements that have harmonious proportions to one another create a sense of beauty and of harmony. Now, you may not think you need a door in a VR experience. It's virtual after all. But if you allude to a way out of your virtual space, you will create a more comfortable experience. While we may not consciously think about getting out of a virtual room, a space without doors and windows creates feelings of constriction and therefore bears a resemblance to a prison. The original idea was to have a wushu performer appear out of thin air at various places during the experience. To add to this sense of magic and mystery, I put abstract objects outside of the main room and they cast these subtle shadows onto the shoji doors. And the artwork you see left in this image appeared to float as if it is weightless. A large artwork of pictograms showing various wushu positions and some 3D models of wushu weapons were draped across large sliding doors at the back, enhancing the visual story of the room as a space for learning kung fu. Here's a short capture from within VR. It's showing my assistant Solveig Stake. The Bee Breeders Archive, Architecture in Virtual Reality, was an architecture competition in 2017. The task was to design a mobile VR architecture museum, and I took this as a challenge in a sprint way, spending only a long weekend designing, modeling, and making the presentation drawings. Unlike most arrivals in the real world, where you enter a new space as a result of a continuous movement through a physical space, arriving in VR can be disorienting. Suddenly you are somewhere. For some users, feeling lost or disoriented can result in frustration and discomfort. And in VR, user comfort is key. And making sure it's easy to navigate and orient oneself in virtual or real space will aid comfort for users generally. Providing the user with a possibility space is similar to how good traditional architectural design allow people to quickly build a mental spatial map of how affordances relate to one another. Here it is exemplified by the atrium and lobby in the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C. In my concept, called Elevate, I wanted to let the visitors see the possibility space before entering the exhibition space. By cutting a spiral opening in the sphere containing the ramp and the artworks, both the navigation and the affordances of the museum were made visible to the visitor before entering the museum itself. The ramp allowed one continuous space for presenting the various exhibits, here symbolized by wood cubes for 3D models and wood spheres for 360 panos. The visitor would then teleport from exhibit to exhibit, and each one would be visible to the other, hopefully resulting in a comfortable navigation. This project entry received an honorary mention in the competition. Now let's take a look at the main case study. For the Norwegian startup Dimension 10, I was asked to design a work and meeting space for their VR collaboration and visualization software Varjo for the AEC industry. Brick-and-mortar meeting rooms are usually fairly small and are designed for a certain number of participants, in addition to what kind of audio-visual equipment is required. They are also filled with lots of furniture, something which you are not really needing in VR. Instead, we looked at larger, more open spaces found in buildings such as museums. The requirement for a large-sized room stemmed from some clients' needs to be able to walk around large models, like a subsea installation at real scale inside the space. This is more similar to an exhibit at a museum such as this one at the National Air and Space Museum in Washington, D.C. When we started the design process, I held a workshop with the core Dimension 10 team, and we each had prepared photographs of architecture and of spaces that we found inspiring, including, amongst others, the Oslo Opera in Norway, and the Frank Lloyd Wright's Guggenheim Museum in New York. Dimension 10 already had an existing room in their software, and it had a number of qualities that we wanted to retain, such as being large, featuring an open plan, having a dome that allowed ample daylight and views to both sky and nature. In their existing room, all of the secondary spaces outside of the central plaza were unused, so that you could not teleport there or use those spaces for other meeting functions. While they did add visual complexity to the space, that design and those polygons were in essence wasted. My initial design ideas were rooted in nature and in Norse mythology and the world tree Yggdrasil. The immense mythical ash tree Yggdrasil plays a central role in Norse cosmology. It connects the 9 worlds, which I saw as a metaphor for meeting and connecting in VR with attendees from different parts of the world. Yggdrasil would also be a Nordic cultural reference, but I didn't think of it as creating a building that looked like a tree. More as in using a tree-like structure with wood trusses or beams to allude to a tree canopy. My resulting design used wood in a geodesic shell structure, which did double duty, or triple, for its restorative effects and for a nod to futurism and Buckminster Fuller, who popularized the idea. And also, from a purely performance point of view, it is the most effective structure in reality as well as in VR for enclosing a dome-shaped space in terms of material or polygon cost. When Oculus launched their new home space on the Quest, I must say I was amused seeing they also had used a geodesic dome. The large circular floor is surrounded by a set of secondary rooms in the form of freestanding pavilions, and the design was opened up a bit more compared to the original design. The spherical dome was compressed to create a more expressive and futuristic space. While you may not think controlling sunshine in VR is a thing, it is. I wanted the sun to shine into the building for the daylight and the warm feeling this would give to the space. But I did not want sunshine to create hard shadows falling on the large circular workspace in the middle, since it would not be possible to render real-time shadows on interactive models contained in there for performance reasons. Now, circles are not easily divided into similar sized modules, so I took inspiration from nature also here, and that was from columnar jointed basalt pillars found in volcanic flow fields, as well as in the impressive design of Frank Lloyd Wright House, Kentuck Knob in Pennsylvania, US. The theory of prospect and refuge, proposed by British geographer J. Appleton and made popular in architecture by Frank Lloyd Wright, seeks to describe why certain environments feel secure and thereby meet basic human psychological needs. Environments that meet such needs will often provide people with the capacity to observe, prospect, without being seen, refuge. In my design, the smaller low-ceiling pavilions serve as a refuge, affording outlooks to the prospects of the large open floor in the middle. Architecture can be defined in a number of ways, but the one that which I really hold dearly is that architecture is about context thinking. This includes taking into consideration the surroundings or the context when you're figuring out your architectural design. When designing VR spaces, the design process is more similar to that of an interior architect than a building architect, in my view. It's literally about designing from the perspective of the human eye and from the inside out instead of from the outside in. You should not look at the building from the analytical view of a 2D projection or an abstract 2D bird's eye view of a 3D model. Instead, try to be at eye level inside of the space you're designing as much as possible. Instead of adapting your design to fit the context of an external constraint, that be one of a neighboring building, a city block, or a natural surrounding, the very surroundings are instead designed to be fit the needs of the VR space you're creating. In this image, you can see a model of an earlier design of the building, which again you can see sits inside of a landscape which is designed to fit around the building. While ideally I would have wanted to place the building in the high mountains of Norway, time and financial constraints required me to purchase an existing third-party model, so I looked for a high mountain scene with lots of green, but without trees, which would have been prohibitive for performance reasons. So why can't I just use a 360 panorama, you might say? Well, this was never an option. Because of the large interior space, creating huge shifts in parallax when moving and looking outside of the large windows, using a single 360 panoramic view would break the illusion of the building being placed in a 3D environment. But combining the 3D terrain that was several thousand feet wide with the panorama image created sufficient depth to sell the illusion. In the design process, we also used the collaboration software itself, meeting virtually and looking at and evaluating the 3D models, including entering into the models at 1:1 scale to discuss the design. Let's take a look at the video that I captured inside VR from the VirtuView software. It will show what it looks like to be inside the space, and we will also take a look at the two 3D models seen during the designer use I had inside the very same software.
Hello, I am Kim Baumann Larsen. I'm the architect and designer of this space for Dimension 10's VirtuView software. And we're standing inside of the lobby or the building that I designed for them. So as you can see, we're standing in the middle of a circular floor, and surrounding the floor we have some vegetation, some trees, sort of an abstract garden, water, a couple of pavilions, some screens, And we're inside of a geodesic dome. What I thought I'd do is that I'll show you a couple of the models that led up to this design, an earlier design, and then one that's pretty close to what we're seeing here. But before I do that, let's just walk a little bit around so you can get a feel for the model. Um, quite happy with these pavilions, how they turned out, and how they kind of contrast the bigger room. And you can see I can't teleport out to these places, although sometimes I want to do that just to get a nice shot. So there we can see the room key. So normally I would then invite somebody else inside of the space so that we can do a design review together. All right. So let's pull out these two models. I have both models now. They're kind of sitting on top of each other. So we're seeing both at the same time. But what I thought I'll do, we'll go inside them. And to do that, I'm going to go to full scale, put my avatar in here, and turn off this model. Okay, so what you see now is the first version, which both myself and the client liked. We can see that it has some of the same features with these secondary meeting rooms that are on the edge. The geodesic dome was a bit coarser, and it's much more angular, and there's a lot more, I guess, a lot more detail, or more individual pieces that would be a lot harder to build for and optimize for the real-time model. It also has this ramp, which was quite cool, and this was what was really inspired by the Guggenheim Museum in New York. And this is like a kind of a secondary space up here where you can do model shots and stuff. But you can also, if you had like, imagine you had like a huge model sitting in the main floor there, you could get sort of like a different vantage point for it. So if we go down here and then we can switch to the other model. And then obviously some of the materials here are not quite right, like the glass there is not really transparent. And you can also see that the floor was started out gray and it was turned into to brown, warmer brown in the end. And also the wood in the pavilions were sort of brighter. You can also see some bugs or some errors here in the model. And you know, this would actually be where I would discover those missing normals and objects and can fix them. And I also designed some super fancy curved screens, but they turn out to be, I guess, a bit too costly in terms of number of polygons required. And this is one of the kind of previous renderings I did in Max with V-Ray to sort of figure out the lighting before I did the lighting inside of Unity. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I think that's it. We can exit full scale and look at the model again. Maybe we'll turn. Yeah, that's fine. All right. All right. So let's get back to the rest of the presentation.
So in the midst of my design process, I went to the US and I attended the Falling Water Immersive Design Residency. The feeling of being grounded and in touch with nature was so overwhelming while at Falling Water, and it resulted in my strengthening the existing concept of bringing nature inside the workspace. The positive effects of nature and of natural surroundings on human well-being and productiveness is well documented in environmental psychology studies. Bringing trees and water inside the building, combined with ample large windows allowing views of the sky and natural landscape, are key features of my design. The high ceiling with a view to the blue sky aids in creative thinking, as previously discussed. The curved pavilions should also provide a high restorative effect and also offer intimate workspaces. It adds visual complexity to the scene and encourages exploration in the environment, qualities which are associated with spaces that are interesting and comfortable to be in. The orange in Dimension 10's brand identity was an obvious color to use for highlighting something important in the space, like the meeting room codes. And these were a dynamic UI element which I had thought about integrating into the architecture from the get-go. The light gray of their brand color was reflected in the virtual gardens and the pavilion meeting room shells. And the almost black brand color can be found in the gradients framing the floor-to-ceiling glass in the pavilions. While there are no real physical materials in virtual reality, it's all pixels after all. Using representations of real natural materials, such as wood, should increase comfort and restoration. The lighter-looking wood of the geodesic structure is ash tree, while the darker and more saturated veneer inside can be seen as a nod to vintage furniture and retrofuturism. The only thing one can say with any certainty when a building is complete is that the design will be changed to fit the needs of the users. VR is no exception here. My original fancy and costly, from a polygon budget point of view, curved screens had to go for more traditional rectilinear ones. One reason for making the pavilions as standalone objects was to make it easier to change them later, and to allow the users to change the materials and colors themselves, depending on their type of meeting, activity, or the visual identity of the client using the software. Here's a version of a pavilion with an orange interior from the previous phase. And here's another one with the white interior. While this feature of interactively changing the color of the space is not implemented by Dimension 10, I think it would be fairly trivial to do so in the future should the needs arise from the users. After all, it is for the users I have designed the space. I'm inevitably asked about how much it costs to design and build a space like this. And I always reply with, it depends. It mostly depends on, as for brick and mortar buildings, how large the space has to be and how much of that space has a floor area that the user will be in close proximity to. Since anything the user is close to will have to be detailed at the one-to-one level. It also depends on what kind of geometry one is working with and how much automation or repetition you can get away with. While the compressed geodesic dome consisted of 5 of these pieces, each rotated 72 degrees. Each of these had 65 unique triangles that again had 2 unique trusses in 3D to be modeled and unwrapped for texturing. Invariably, time and cost also depends on what the design looks like. Designing on a radial, non-Cartesian grid means detailing can suddenly become very, very time-consuming. My first concept, seen here, while liked by both the client and myself, proved too costly in time to detail and to optimize to get into the Unity engine. As in real life, having many unique components in the design will become more expensive than more repetition. On the other hand, the more time you invest in a design, the higher quality design you will likely get. For now, having finished this project successfully, it has been extremely inspiring for me to meet and work with new clients inside of my own architecture, and my clients say the same. In designing my next virtual workspace, I'm using lessons I learned from this project to increase my productivity, but I also seek to include more sound design and have some animated elements and even more nature inside this time with a few swimming fishes. In concluding my talk, I would like to reflect on some of the challenges and my hopes for the future of virtual architecture. Architecture, products, and services alike are the results of the time we live in, and they're shaped by many, many inputs, including the tools we use to create them. While I have tried working with VR tools like Quill, Tiltbrush, Blocks, Masterpiece, and Gravity Sketch, to name a few, none of those are working for me. Why not? Well, I need the control over polygons given by 3D tools like 3D Studio Max or Maya, and the accuracy of CAD tools like AutoCAD, MicroStation, or Rhino. My hope is that someone, somewhere, is working to create an architectural VR design tool that is built from the ground up for VR. I believe that when we can truly start designing virtual and brick-and-mortar spaces from the inside as a collaborative effort in a social VR-enabled design tool, it will profoundly change our designs, making them more human, inclusive, and user-friendly. Today, it's still impossible to create performant VR spaces with realistic lighting and materials that can also change shape in real time. The render engines can do it. We just need more powerful graphics cards to do this in VR. This is where we're going. Beautiful, inspiring virtual architectural spaces with responsive designs where the environment itself react and change to the needs of the users. An architecture that will fundamentally change how humans interact with each other and with the virtual buildings. As virtual reality matures and more people spend increasing time inside a myriad of virtual environments for work, education, and play, we should look to both environmental psychology and architectural and urban design theory, as well as environmental and visual storytelling, to make sure we create comfortable spaces and trigger the appropriate feelings in users as they socialize and explore an infinite number of virtual universes. Thank you very much for your attention in listening and looking at my talk. I will be very happy to respond to questions if you have some over email. During the live RTC event, I was asked about book recommendations. So here are a few of my favorite ones for designing experiences for VR. Pallasma's The Eyes of the Skin, which was used at the Falling Water Immersive Design Residency. Mind in Architecture has its roots in Minding Design Symposium that took place at Taliesin, which is the Frank Lloyd Wright School of Architecture. And my interest in Asian architecture, in particular Japanese architecture and philosophy, has led me to books like In Praise of Shadows and Wabi Sabi, the Japanese art. The architect Henry Plummer has written several good books on the use of natural lighting in architecture and in Nordic architecture specifically. And his experience of architecture is amazing in discussing the capacity of buildings to support or diminish the spontaneous powers of human beings to act in space. Philosopher Gaston Bachelard's book The Poetics of Space takes not surprisingly a more philosophical approach to the personal, emotional response to buildings, both in life and in literary works. The most recent books I've read on the impact of our environments on architecture on our emotions and actions are Places of the Heart, The Psychogeography of Everyday Life by Colin Ellard and The Shaping of Us, How Everyday Spaces Structure Our Lives, Behavior and Well-Being by Lily Bernheimer. I can't recommend them enough. As part of my research into color for a VR game I'm designing and producing, I've read a number of books on color and how they affect us. By far the most interesting one was On Color by David Scott Castan and Stephen Foding, although the audible-only book How Colors Affect You by Professor William Lidwell has the most concrete examples related to architectural design. On storytelling in VR, I can recommend a few, and Storytelling for Virtual Reality has numerous viewpoints from VR professionals. While Craig Caldwell's book, Story Structure and Development, has only a single chapter on VR, it is very well written and a great resource for structuring your story regardless of your medium. In the Tiny VR UX book, I have bought more of those, more of them than I can remember, and I gift it to friends and colleagues. It was published in 2016 and it contains many valuable lessons that still holds true. The Tiny 101 books on architecture and urban design have been recommended to me by professional game designer friends, and they have very short texts, lots of diagrams, tons of drawings, and are super easy to get into. The visual story was written primarily for film and TV, but it is, apart from the chapter on framing obviously, super useful for visual storytelling in VR. The image of the city is referenced in an architectural approach to level design, and they are both great for designing games and interactive VR alike. So, to conclude, thanks yet again for listening to my talk, and as already mentioned, I will be very, very happy to respond to questions over email or Twitter.